Welcome and good evening. My name is Corinne DeBray, and I'm Managing Director here at the Foster. So tonight, I am very pleased to introduce Graham Beal. He is the former director of the Detroit Institute of the Arts Museum, DIA. As our speaker, he's going to be discussing British landscape art traditions and concepts beginning as early as the 1700s. And I think I'm really looking forward to hearing more about his perspective. But also it helps to illustrate a contextual framework for, and establishing some connections to Tony Foster's work. So we're always excited about learning more about how his work relates in the larger art world. Graham is a native of Great Britain, and after a successful career in the UK and the US, he's settled with his wife Nancy in Northern California, and we are very fortunate to have him here tonight as our My Journey with Tony speaker this month. Please join me in welcoming Graham Beal.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. In the 80s, I was chief curator at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And one day, and part of the job description was that you visited studios, had artists come to show you their work. And one of those artists was Tony Foster. And I looked at his work, admired it greatly, but had to tell him frankly that there probably wasn't much chance that we would be including his work in the foreseeable programs of the museum. Museum exhibition programs, especially large ones, are planned 3 to 5 years in advance. So you're always looking at the context. And with what I knew of everything else that was going on, and chief curator sounds very grand, but it's by no means the final decision maker. But I suggested that Tony go to a dealer in town who I know and admired, Peter Fairbanks, although Peter did not, in fact, exhibit living artists at that time. And I tried to remember why I thought this was a good idea, but I did. And Tony went, and Peter, in fact, did like his work and took him on as his only living artist. I also recommended Tony to go and see Jim Ballinger, who will be speaking here in a couple of months' time. He was the director of the Phoenix Art Museum because Tony either then was or was thinking about a Grand Canyon expedition journey, and Jim liked his work too and committed to Tony's exhibition. And then the only contact I had with Tony after that was when I went from San Francisco to practice being a director in Omaha, Nebraska at the Joslin Art Museum. I got a request from Tony to write an introductory essay for his planned journey to Costa Rica, and I did that, and that was sometime in the early 90s, and then I didn't see, really, I heard from Tony from time to time, didn't see him again until I attended the opening of his exhibition 2 years ago at the Royal Watercolor Society galleries in London. He didn't recognize me. So that, and I wouldn't have recognized him if there hadn't been a photograph of him hanging in the lobby. What is my journey with Tony? It's not like, I think, like the ones that you've seen so far. An object cannot compare with an experience. You won't meet Hamish Fulton again, you'll meet someone very like him, Richard Long, but Hamish Fulton was an artist, still alive, whose work is largely based on walking, experiencing the landscape, finding ways to express and to convey the flavor and the texture of his personal interactions with nature. So this is a book that it's a bit blurry because I got it online, but it's a book that Hamish Fulton just published. I haven't read it myself yet. But I think that photograph really pretty much validates that statement there. That gives, I suffer a little bit from vertigo, and that's certainly looking at Tony. And it's all I can do to actually to look at it without my stomach falling. But I won't be talking a great deal about Tony. Because I haven't had the literal journey with him, I thought I'd explore the two main threads to me in Tony's, well, maybe three, in Tony's work. I don't know how those slides got there. They were supposed to be later. Something's happened there's a ghost in the machine there. Watercolor painting occupies a place in British art like it does in no other country's art. It is simply an absolute constant, decade after decade after decade. It goes back to the mid-18th century, but was really established at the end, the last quarter, with artists like John Mallord William Turner and William Girtin. And this is a Turner of Tintern Abbey, of romantic, well into the romantic era. A highly finished drawing, not a sketch, would not have been done in this shape outside, probably, but highly finished. Looking at ruins, it's full of nostalgia, full of the sense of loss, but also conveying a sort of sense of a national patrimony. So that one aspect there. On the other hand, this is a small, I tried not to blow these up too much because these are about that size, of Petworth Park, where he's captured this brilliant sunset in the south, in Sussex, in the south of England, very near to where I grew up. But a work not particularly of melancholy, but a work of some considerable raw power. John Sell Cotman was part of a small group of artists who worked in the eastern part of England. What you see with Cotman that I return to is that unlike the first Turner, and unlike this Cotman, with the Greta Bridge, you get this very strong sense, a definite sense of illusion, of looking through a window, but there's also a kind of flatness to it. The various parts interlock. You move across the painting, moving from one plane to the plane behind it, but without really sort of feeling that you step behind it. It's the miracle of Vermeer. It's what makes Vermeer so much more powerful artistically than all of his other great artists like Gerard de Borch. A view in the Highlands. This was the time when people had become concerned with the idea of the sublime, the notion that part of beauty, part of the life experience was in fact something like terror. The word horrid that we use to mean nasty originally meant kind of covered with lichen and covered with moss and shaggy and all this kind of thing. Awful used to mean it filled you full of awe. We don't really use it that way much anymore. So all of that is built into these areas, and behind it lies the notion that the artist actually had to get there to do this. That was, sometimes it's a bit of a trick because you look at some of those Hudson River School paintings that look as if you're right out in we bought a Hudson River seascape when I was in Detroit, and the curator making the presentation showed this sea with all kinds of wood floating around in it. And then he showed a slide of the scene behind you if you turned round 180 degrees, and it was like 4 hotels and a promenade and a balustrade. So you never quite know whether this was a newly fashionable tourist place or really somewhere that no one had ever been before. Also, watercolor work, I'm sticking to the same period, showing what the different artists could get different things, all from watercolors. These are all watercolor paintings. Samuel Palmer, he used a lot of what's called body color, china white, to give a kind of a texture to the paint. But here you see scenes of an area called in Kent, where he went. He was influenced by William Blake, and they went off to form a little artist colony and to be close to God. That was the idea. So here you have a mixture of kind of Kent and Jerusalem in these pictures. So here you see coming from church. Here's a hilly scene, but very dense, almost claustrophobic, but really quite emotional. And then this rustic contentment, which we don't know the date. But Samuel Palmer, he went on to build a long career. He was very young at this time. Went on to build a long career as a watercolor landscape artist, creating and exhibiting, as I say, unlike not many other countries, exhibiting large, huge watercolors, highly finished. I do want to take a little step aside because when I wrote about Tony's work in Costa Rica, I was at the Jocelyn Art Museum in Omaha, and it had there the complete collection of Maximilian Zuvide, the gentleman there, who was a pupil of Alexander von Humboldt, and who came to the States and took a journey up the Mississippi and the Missouri to what is now Montana, and stayed with the Mandan and other nations up there. The man standing behind him is Karl Bodmer, a Swiss artist who he took with him, who painted all of the illustrations of what Maximilian thought was going to be his publications, but didn't turn out that way. And Bodmer ended up producing his paintings as prints. But he went up into areas of great danger, places where few people had been before, and certainly not too many European princes and Swiss artists had been before. So when I wrote about Tony's Costa Rican trip, I compared him to Karl Bodmer as an artist who would have had all of his accoutrements on his back, much as the same way as you see Tony, but taking his paint, having to paint outside all the time to get the sketches done, come back to do them, to do finished versions in the studio. The irony is, in this case, the journey was in 1833-34, and photography was invented just a few years later. So 10 years after this, you'd have had people lugging cumbersome photography equipment with them. We hadn't quite reached that point yet. And then Edward Lear, moving through the century, again going to the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East, used to be called the Near East. But again, going to places that were quite dangerous, not quite as dangerous as the animals in the pea green boat, perhaps. But William Holman Hunt, the pre-Raphaelite artist who's currently featured in the exhibition at the De Young, he painted one of his pictures, The Scapegoat. He painted it with a rifle across his knee as he sat out in the Dead Sea landscape, because he might have had to use it. So these were not timid individuals by any means. Jumping forward now, I could have gone decade by decade, but there's no point in doing that. You come into the 20th century, all of the kind of things that I do want to back up. Just here, you see the extreme finish and the extreme illusionism of that, the great depth, the great meticulous realism of this in Edward Lear's painted in the studio when he came back from his trip, sometimes over a period of 2 or 3 years to create those images. But you move into the 20th century, all that stuff with modernism is just thrown out of the window. And you have artists who remain, British artists remain passionately committed to the landscape. There's, on the top there is a Paul Nash painting of he was a war artist hired by the government to go out and paint in the First World War. And then again, I think he was the only British modern artist who was a war artist for both wars. But his real interest was in surrealism. This is based on the Sussex countryside here. This is called the Seven Sisters, chalk downs, the same chalk strata as Dover. But you can see that he has sort of done things to the landscape. This is not meant to be real, it's meant to convey convey the feeling. And this downed Luftwaffe aircraft is almost eaten by the landscape. It's actually being absorbed. And then this Wilmington Giant by Eric Revilius. There was later, right before the war, there was a swing in artists. A book was published a couple of years ago called Romantic Moderns, when people like Eric Revilius disengaged from the kind of the intellectual activity of modern contemporary art and re-engaged with the landscape and with older issues. But big jump here. Henry Moore, he was the great British sculptor. His whole mantra was truth to materials. He got a lump of stone or wood or whatever it was early in his career, and he would work with that, trying to be guided by the various grains of the wood to create the figure. I love this one because it's in the Detroit Institute of Arts collection of 1939, and Henry Moore did actually once say that if he had a favorite sculpture, it was that one. So that was, but then you can see the point I'm trying to make here is how strongly related the figure is to landscape in itself and in the context in which Moore chose to put it, and to the end of his life. Especially when he could do whatever he wanted, he would have create a sculpture, have his studio assistants make one out of polystyrene, expanded styrofoam, and then put it out into the fields so that he could look at them. And the wind would come and blow them away, and then the assistants would go out and put it back together again so he could go on looking at it. Well, I'm now moving into my own lifetime, Tony's lifetime. We're about the same age. The sculpture on the top by Anthony Caro called Midday, and Tony Caro was with David Hockney and others, the generation that left Paris behind and came over to New York. And when Caro was in New York, he encountered the steel sculpture of David Smith and was completely converted. And went back and was determined to bring this new gospel back to England, Britain, that art didn't have to be of wood or marble or bronze. It could be of whatever you wanted. I rather, I don't know, not very kindly like to use this slide of this early Caro, thinking that maybe it could be entitled not Midday, but Reclining Figure, because he made the material shift, but the mental shift was not yet complete. It would happen. And the idea was that you could use any material you wanted for sculpture. It didn't have to be these traditional things. So here we have this William Tucker sculpture, Anabasis 1, that consists of plaster, of some kind of resin, and of metal put together, and it doesn't mean anything. It's not meant to convey anything at all. It's very cool and very standoffish emotionally. So this is the shift sort of away from that human and landscape related sculpture. But there were other artists who were even more radical. Barry Flanagan said, the artist of the piece on the left there, said that art is going on all around you. All you have to do is join in. The notion was that really it wasn't just metal, it wasn't just substances, plastic things that you could use for sculpture. Anything was game. So this sculpture here consists of bags that are filled with sand, and the same material circle and this rope with absolutely no instructions on how to install it. Whoever owned that can do whatever they want with it. They must use local sand. Well, I tried to borrow this sculpture for an exhibition at SF MoMA, the last one I did when I was there, called A Quiet Revolution. And the conservators at the conservators at the Tate that owns this specified I mean, I'm not sure, my wife can probably help me out here, she's a scientist, gave the chemical formula for the sand that we had to use to put in because it had entered a museum. It actually had become dead. It was the opposite of what the artist wanted. They also wanted to do away with plinths, the idea that art would contact directly, and so. But here's Keith Arnett, very with great expression, showing how, in fact, what little relationship plinths have to life, bases that that none of those positions are tenable for very long. Richard Long also trying to find ways to think about landscape. This piece, England, 1968, that cross. Most proud English gardeners don't want a single daisy anywhere on their lawn. So this looks like an incomplete job to most people. But Richard Long has just taken a lawnmower and carved out this particular shape, creating a new space, creating some kind of statement. In this one here, I'm sorry, you can't read that. This reads, a line made by walking. So Richard Long just walked up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down until he wore the grass. So you think about that. You think, my God, how deep is that grass? How long would that take? You begin to experience, you begin to feel the experience more than the object. It's very, very incredibly economic statement. Now, Richard Long in 1984 said, in the 60s there was a feeling that art need not be a production line of more objects to fill the world. My interest was in a more thoughtful view of art and nature, making art both visible and invisible, using ideas, walking, stones, tracks, water, time, etc., in a flexible way. It was the antithesis of so-called American land art, where the artist needed money to be an artist, to buy real estate to claim possession of the land, and to wield machinery, true capitalist art. To walk the Himalayas is to touch the earth lightly and has more personal physical commitment than an artist who plans a large earthwork that is then made by bulldozers. I admire the spirit of the American Indian more than that of the contemporary land artist. I prefer to be a custodian of nature, not an exploiter. I want to do away with nuclear weapons, not make art that can withstand them. That very much embodies the notion of art. Richard's photographs that you just saw, when he let them into the public, he stated that they went into the public domain. They were not art. They were not photographs that were to be bought and sold. Anybody could reproduce them, could do anything that they wanted with them. So it's all very, 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 very 60s. Because Richard Long's art is based on the walk, as Hamish Fulton's was. I think Long is a little more central than Fulton, so that's why I've emphasized him in this brief discussion. But here you can see what it says: a low water circle walk, a 7-day circular walk around and inside a circle in the Highlands, Scotland, summer 1980. So again, you imagine, and he's specified that this is a low water walk, so it's not a walk that you can do at high water. He's tried to make it a circle, but every time he comes to barriers that he can't continue the circle, he has to adapt to them. So again, you think about this 7 days, and it's all there on that circle drawn on what is a government survey map. On the other hand, he makes sculpture when he goes on his long walks. I tried to get one photograph from the Himalayas because that's what he referenced, but I couldn't get one that didn't pixelate horribly when it was blown up. So this is of the Sahara, work that he made in the Sahara. So he made that and he left it there. It's not for sale. No one's looking after it. If you want to see it, you've got to do the same thing that he did. You've got to experience the same whole walk that he did. And I did find some pictures of his line that he made in the Himalayas, but that walk was done when Long was still only using black and white, and the ones that were good quality were all color. So it had to have been made, interestingly enough, by someone who made the walk that Richard Long did to get to that piece. And this one, a 60-minute circle in the on Dartmoor. There he just simply says what he sees as he walks through, but he can bring his work into the galleries and use the raw materials of his walks, the things that he encounters in streams or wherever, mud. He makes mud drawings and things like that to convey that sense of nature. And I know you can't see this very much, but this is a photograph of a valley in the Highlands, and he has basically, again, specified what it was he saw, what he did, what his experiences were. Shifting slightly, but still, I think, staying with nature, these works by Tony Cragg, cubes, they clearly relate to something like a Donald Judd, Untitled, 1972, very minimalist, very abstract, but the spectrum on the top there was made entirely from plastic debris selected by his students from the Rhine. He was teaching in Düsseldorf at the time, entirely made from refuse found in the river and on the river banks. But then you also see a slightly political component to his work in Britain seen from the north. You know, in British, all maps are always seen from the, you assume you're orientated from the south. Of course, it's not quite. It's as if that figure was seeing Britain from the north, but it's not actually Britain seen from the north. It's Britain laid on its side. But there's a lot of, as there is in this country, there's a lot of the politics of regionalism and the abiding resentment of the north towards the seeming abundance in the south is what Tony is referencing and Cragg is referencing in that picture. David Nash, when he graduated from college, took himself off to the site of the first romantic landscape paintings in Britain, the mountains of North Wales, and went to live there because he didn't have much money and life up there was very, very cheap, and he was able to get an old disused Methodist chapel as a studio, and he lived in what used to be the changing room of the minister there. But he just basically engaged himself with the landscape around, working exclusively with wood. He made this boulder, which he then pried himself, that we have photographs of him sort of leveraging it into the water, that he then just let it go down the river, hoping that it would eventually find its way to the sea. It got stuck a couple of times, so he had to go out and give it a bit of a help. But over a decade, when it changed its appearance completely, it finally found its way to the sea. So again, an experience. It's a sphere, but it's pretty rudimentary, and there was no possible monetary compensation for this. It was something that he did as a notion of time and nature. And similarly, in 1978, he learned the craft of plashing and grafting plants to plant a circle of ashes that over the next few years he grafted and plashed, cut, to make them begin to form an arch. And he called it Millennium Dome. Started off as Millennium Dome, but it became Ash Dome because it came together too quickly. It came together far too long before the millennium for it to happen. Nature took over, and the dome formed itself after 5 or 6 or 7 years of him doing the training. Similarly, he takes minimalist shapes, like the piece in the middle, where he just takes those sort of planks of wood, square planks, and cuts almost all the way through on each one, and then hangs them up and lets them dry out. And as they dry, they warp. Yes, he's called. This is one of his crack and warp pieces, and they begin to express themselves through whatever their own physical makeup was. You know, things may fall off, bits may fall off, and that's all part of the process. And then this piece down at the bottom here, you see how he never uses pigments. If he wants a very red color, he'll find a red wood. a raw redwood, or he will use fire to create the black. And so again, there's this sense of ecology, a sense of recycling, a sense of letting nature be part of this whole activity. And I suppose, for want of a better word, a kind of a moral stance about why you're making art. And so finally, to Tony. Well, what we see in Tony is the great tradition of British landscape art. We see it being done with meticulous care. We know, you all know from better than I do, the kind of things that he's gone through on each of these trips, the kind of risks he's taken, the kind of burdens he's borne. But here you see the main panel, the main drawing done meticulously, but it has much more in common with the Cotman in terms of its attention to surface. It's a 20th century. It has more to do with Eric Ravilius and Cotman than it does with Turner or with Lear. And then at the bottom here you have these various panels that expand on what was going on in this issue. It's not literary. It's not exactly a narrative, but it's suggesting that this is not it. You look at this and it's beautiful, but it's really not. That's all that's there to see. I chose that bit, but I also was sort of interested in these too, and worth recording. Similarly here, and you can see in these works around you, you have not only the image of the Grand Canyon, but you have these objects below that also talk about the fact that there were these beautiful butterflies and various flints and stones and bits of foliage that he found that feed into themselves, that are themselves worth exploring. Again, the same with this one here, with the necklace below, which represents the necklaces that he and his wife Annie were wearing in those photographs that were in the wrong place earlier on. But that was supposed to be my proof that I finally had journeyed to Tony, because I had dinner with him twice in Cornwall this last summer when my wife and I, Nancy, were back in England. And this is just a short mile to Ordrith Marsh, just a short mile from his home. But I mean, just look at those colours. Look at the way that those plants slam themselves against the picture plane. They're real. You can sense that there's recession and that they're round and there's modelling and all that kind of thing. But it is a completely, I was going to say 20th, but 21st century art. It's a work that both follows the grand traditions and the demands of the 19th century realist landscape and of the modernist need to express the painting as paint on paper and not simply an illusion. And finally, there is me. Look, I'm taking a photograph. I hope it looks as if I'm saluting, but that's in Tony's studio. Each of these little icons, and I use the word correctly, each of these little icons are the distillation of each one of the journeys that Tony has made, a kind of conceptual reference to that links him to artists in the 20th century, such as Richard Long and David Nash. And I think, thank you.